Hello there everyone, welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This is History with Sire here today for our final video on this term for our civil rights module we've been doing together. We've done a whole host of history now, right back in the 1770s, all the way up to the 1970s, about a good 200 years of a breadth study here. But now we're at the final part, which is Martin Luther King, so Martin Luther King historiography, particularly assessing the extent he made the most important contribution towards civil rights progress. So this video is going to be it's more so for the university level, for those of you out there who are studying deeply about Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement as a whole and its whole progress that has happened. There'll be variations to this question, again, as historians have shown throughout the years, both during and after Martin Luther King's passing. And so it's important to remember that as we go forward. The knowledge I'm going to give you here, the ideas I suggest, can always be adapted, tailored towards what you're writing, whether it's a research essay, a thesis question, a full-on dissertation, or maybe, if you're truly, or maybe at the recreational level, simply here to enjoy and try and understand some wider historical thinking about Martin Luther King Jr. So with all that said, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. So here we are. I'll give you an overview of the King historiography. Now, I will admit this is not an exhaustive list. It's just a few of the resources that I've used and historians' work to come to some judgments and some criteria ideas for you to use. There are a whole host of others. These are the ones that I've considered. David Garrow with Bearing the Cross, which arguably is the most definitive biography on Martin Luther King there is. There are several others, but this is probably the go-to one for those people who initially researched it. John Kirk, Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, a good overview text. We also have Stephen Lawson and Charles Payne. They provide a whole wealth of knowledge, collating a lot of historians' ideas in the principal timeline for Martin Luther King, which is the 1940s into the 1960s. And then August Meier, a very timely historiographical biography on Martin Luther King during a time when he was still alive. So that's obviously worth some mentioning as well. But there are some other historians, Peter Ling, Zoe Polly, Vivian Saunders have done some works as well. So there's a lot you can bring in here, and don't feel yourself to restrict just the ones that I've brought here. But just bear in mind that when I'm giving this information on my following slides, these are the four works that I've based a lot of my information around for this video. So, some key criteria that comes up with all these historians that they consider when measuring the extent that King helped improve civil rights are the following. They always make a comparison between de jure and de facto progress. I've said these two Latin terms a lot in our videos in this series, but they're very, very important. It's all good saying there's been lawful change in the system because of Martin Luther King, but did he really bring out real de facto change that people could feel and understand in their everyday lives? It's very important to consider that when you're going through things like the legislation he got through, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and many other things. Was it just him? And was there real progress in reality brought about because of this change? We also have to consider if King was the driving force or just simply one of many members. We'll touch more on these factors in a second, but King is but one man, and he of course is not alive for the entirety of this timeline. And so we've got to consider that as well. Can we really consider him the main driving force if he wasn't there the whole time? Or maybe it's fair to say, in comparison to other people and other groups, he was the main driving force because he oversaw a massive period of change and he was there for some big key events as we saw. Just a few lists on the screen: Montgomery, Birmingham, Washington, the Selma marches. He has done quite a lot in his short time on the world, so it's very important to consider that. But there are indeed other factors to consider: grassroots, presidents, the media are just some I've suggested. Again, you may actually, in your own readings, come across other individuals who mention many others. So it's important to remember that. Do you consider him the main driving force when there's so many other people, or was he just simply one man? And of course, another key question is what timeline will you use when assessing King? That's a very important one we'll say more about shortly. So, generally, across these readings, and I imagine many others in the King debate, these are the three big views that come about. The first one is the thesis idea, which is that King indeed was the driving force, and that without his leadership, progress would have never occurred. He is, as we said in our series, he was a key driving force in a lot of events, like Birmingham, like Washington, and a key leader in Montgomery. And so maybe these historians will argue without King, this progress would not have been achieved. And even with the other ones that were present, his actions were the ones that were most important. He was the most important and therefore should not be overlooked despite his short time. The next one is the complete antithesis to this that goes against the thesis idea, which actually says no, it was grassroots movement and maybe the actions of the presidents and federal government. They were more important than King. Again, he was just one man and he's just one member of this big, vast, wide movement. The Washington speech is a key example of that. Yes, he gave that speech. It was a brilliant speech and it inspired millions of people. But without the crowd there, without the media to watch it, without the presidents to react to it, would it have been as famous and as remembered as we say it is? And so these historians will say it's not the main cause of progress, and therefore the movements and maybe other leaders were indeed more important. And the third and final key view is the synthesis perspective. This is a bit more recent in historiography, very 21st century, which is this idea that actually there was equal importance, that the grassroots movement was important, but so was King, and he played his role as he should have done, and therefore brought it all together. And therefore, a combination of factors is the main reason for progress. You might see these maybe actually narrow it down. They won't necessarily say one factor is outright the most important, but they might combine two together: King and the media, King and grassroots, maybe grassroots and the presidency. It all depends on the historian's viewpoint and the evidence they use. So do, of course, bear that in mind when you read these historians' works. Maybe make that decision yourself with the knowledge you gather for which is the most convincing view to follow. I also want to touch on this idea of timelines, as I said before, and it's a very important key question. When does the civil rights movement actually begin? That's a very important thing to note with the historians you read, and maybe when you design your thesis question yourself, if you are able to understand that. Because, yes, most of you will probably have, let's say you're being assigned this by a teacher or a lecturer, they'll probably have a narrow timeline between the 1940s or 1960s, maybe even tighter still, maybe just simply between Montgomery and King's assassination in 1968. But again, you could have wider ones. You can expand this further. The civil rights movement, in the modern sense, was in the 50s and 60s, but actual civil rights progress was spanning right the way back. Again, we experienced it, a lot of it with the pre-Civil War era, slave trade, the Civil War itself, all the progress that happened there. We had, of course, the Emancipation Proclamation from Lincoln, the Free Reconstruction Amendments, the Enforcement Acts, and many other civil rights leaders as well. Booker T. Washington, Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, Randolph, Marshall. The list goes on. And so it really depends where in the timeline you are, which leader gets the most importance and which one we can give the most focus to. So really, on a timeline that spans from the 1790s to the 1980s, King is but a major player in about 20 years of that timeline. Actually, not even that. When you think about it, on his key actions, it's arguably just over 10 years. So you've got to remember that. You've got to understand that when you define your timeline in your thesis essay, how far back you want to go. Again, it's all about how you want to frame it and shape it. But again, when you do expand that timeline, do acknowledge it if you're going to be that bold and brave to do it. And again, do check with your lecturers and educators if you're able to do that. They might actually counter that and want you just to narrow it, keep it within the lifetime of King and assess them against more present leaders. So do bear that in mind when you design your thesis question, how you're going to frame it, how you are going to answer it. And then the idea really comes down to you. Which view will you find the most convincing? Was really the King the main driving force? Was it the movements or something else? Or is it a combination of factors that can be brought together to show this change and that indeed he was not the only thing to achieve it? It was in combination with other factors that allowed it to happen. Again, it's entirely down to your judgment, as long as you back it up with some key context. And again, bringing that criteria I mentioned that the historians do use. If you bring in those ideas, it will support what you say and strengthen your argument quite a lot. But the decision is yours. I'm merely here as a guide for this one. It is on you to go away, do that wider reading yourself. I will be putting those readings in the description box below and a couple extras you may wish to consider. Again, there's a lot of this area we've not covered, simply because of the constraints of the curriculum. But again, there's a lot more to learn, and do indeed seek it out. Maybe, as I've been saying throughout it, request in the comment sections. Again, I'll always read those, I'll always take into account your engagement, and maybe add some additional bonus videos like I've done with my First World War series for you to check out and consider and expand your knowledge further. But the beautiful thing about history is there is indeed always more to learn. But thank you all for watching. I hope you found this video series insightful. It's been quite a long one, hopefully quite a useful one for you out there in your studies. Search for more history. Thank you as always for watching. I'll see you all for our next term very, very soon. This has been History with Sire. Thank you for listening.